Hello and welcome to the Institute for Global Engagement's Faith and International Affairs conference call series. My name is John Gallagher, President and CEO of IGE, and I have the honor to serve as the moderator on today's call. We have the privilege of hearing today from Madam Bayan Sami Abdul Rahman, the Kurdistan Regional Government Representative to the United States, for our discussion titled Issues Facing Kurdistan. Before we hear from Representative Abdul Rahman, let me say a few words about her personal and distinguished professional background. Prior to her appointment to the United States in 2015, Bayan was the High Representative to the United Kingdom for 10 years, beginning in 2005. During this period, she brought Kurdistan's profile, its challenges, and priorities into focus for the United Kingdom and the international community. Previously, she was elected to the Leadership Council of the Kurdistan Democratic Party in 2010. Before her career in public service, she worked as a journalist for 17 years in the United Kingdom and Japan, providing impactful coverage and commentary on critical events. Her late father, Sami Abdul Rahman, was a veteran of the Kurdish freedom movement, joining the Kurdistan Democratic Party in 1963 and playing a critical leadership role in the Kurdish and Iraqi opposition to Saddam Hussein's regime. He held the post of Deputy Prime Minister of the Kurdistan Regional Government and General Secretary of the Kurdistan Democratic Party. IGE is thankful for our collaboration with the KRG as we seek to highlight Kurdistan's importance as a partner in the region, particularly its urgent economic needs and our shared interest in advancing coexistence, stability, and reconciliation. As noted in the conference call invitation, IGE is working with the KRG on a conference series and a resulting plan of action that will promote tangible reconciliation across civil society, faith traditions, business, and governments through equal citizenship and rule of law, only tens of kilometers from and in contrast to ISIS's vision of sectarian division and violence. The first event in our series will occur on 12 April in Washington, D.C. at the Microsoft offices. In recent years, the Kurdistan Regional Government has outlined its objectives for good governance and transparency, stating, quote, "The KRG seeks to publicly demonstrate its long-term commitment to rule of law and to being a progressive and socially responsible government that can make challenging reforms on behalf of our citizens. This will take time but pay undeniable dividends in the region and indeed to all of Iraq, positively impacting the lives of millions. We see our conference series in DC and Erbil as bringing visibility and support to this strategic intent. Underlying this vision is the immediate call for economic support and investment. Bayan will address Kurdistan's economic and security crises as two sides of the same coin, noting that Kurdistan's future stability has profound implications for the U.S. and the region at large. As such, we are thankful to have this opportunity to discuss such pressing matters. Before we get started, just a few words on today's call format. We'll begin with about 20 minutes of remarks from Bayan, and then we'll open the floor for your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please press 5* at any point during the call, and you'll be placed in the queue. Please also note that this call is on the record, and an audio is available on the IGE website in our media library, globalengage.org. So with that introduction, let's turn now to our call. Thanks again, Bayan, for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, John, and I would like to thank IGE for all of your support to the people of Kurdistan and for allowing me the opportunity to speak to you today. If I may, I'm going to start by putting forward to you all the challenges that we face in Kurdistan and possibly also how you can help. I will start with February 2014, just over 2 years ago. Prime Minister Maliki, the then Prime Minister of Iraq, unilaterally decided to cut off Kurdistan region's budget. The Kurdistan region is entitled to a share of Iraq's budget, and this is set out in the Iraqi constitution. Suddenly, in February 2014, Prime Minister Maliki decided to cut off our budget. So this was the first shock to our economy. Then, 4 months later, in June 2014, ISIS overran the city of Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, also within the Middle East, a culturally, commercially, and historically, politically important center, Mosul. So ISIS takes over Mosul, and within a couple of months, It is attacking Kurdish areas. It is committing genocide against the Yazidis, Christians, and other communities. This leads to the other shock that we faced, a flood of refugees and displaced people. Then the final shock to our economy is the dramatic drop in oil prices. So today, Kurdistan is facing the following challenges. We are fighting ISIS. We are the most effective ground force against them, but we have a 1,000-kilometer front line, which I believe is about 650 miles. And this is an active front line. They send suicide missions. There are IEDs, mines, unexploded devices. ISIS is even using chemical weapons along this front line. This is a very costly war for us, both in lives and injuries, but also in terms of the cost of maintaining an army that is fighting ISIS on a daily basis. The other challenge that we face is the humanitarian one. As a result of the Syrian civil war and the displacement caused by ISIS within Iraq, our population in Kurdistan region in Iraq has jumped by 30% in a very short period of time. We are taking care of 1.8 million Syrian refugees and displaced Iraqis. The displaced Iraqis, who are they? Well, it's the vast majority of Christians in Iraq. They now shelter in Kurdistan. The vast majority of Yazidis, other minorities such as Turkmen, Shabaks, Karkis, Sabians, Mandayans, but also people from the larger communities in Iraq, the Sunni and Shia Arab communities. Some of them have also fled ISIS and are sheltering with us. 1.8 million people relying on our government for food, for electricity, for healthcare, for education, for every possible service that a community needs. And we are struggling with that as well, because the United States finds it very difficult to raise enough money to deal with this community. So even though the UN is helping us, and the United States is the biggest donor to the UN in Iraq, still a large portion of the burden falls on us, on our government. I'm very proud that the Kurdish community has really done a great deal to welcome the displaced community. They have shared food, they have provided shelter, and so on. But this can't continue forever. The UN has designated the humanitarian crisis a level 3 crisis, which is the highest level, the worst kind of crisis. It's had that designation for nearly 2 years. And how are we supposed to sustain that while we're fighting ISIS, while we don't get a budget transfer from Baghdad? And the world is finding it difficult to raise money to help us. So the other challenge that I mentioned is the drop in oil prices. We are exporting oil independently of Baghdad, and if anybody wants, I can go into the reasons for that later. But in summary, we are exporting oil through a pipeline that goes through Turkey and onto the Mediterranean to the international markets. But the fall in oil prices has impacted us enormously. The price of oil used to be well over $100 a barrel. Today, it's around $30 a barrel. So this is impacting our revenues, our budget, and what we can do with the little amount of money that we're getting. Our government, the Kurdistan Regional Government, has implemented very severe austerity measures. The Kurdistan Regional Government's operational budget is down to 20% of what it used to be. I ask you to imagine if your state or even the federal government in the United States had to bring down its operational budget to 20% of what it used to be in a very sharp, quick manner, not over time, not in an orderly fashion. How would your town or your state or the United States cope? But this is what we are being forced to do. The Kurdistan Regional Government's investment budget, these are investments in bridges, roads, hospitals, schools, is zero. So thousands of government projects that were helping to build Kurdistan's infrastructure have been suspended since 2014. So this is where we are. At the same time, we're fighting ISIS. We need to fight ISIS. This is absolutely our priority. We want to protect our own population from this brutal, tyrannical, frankly savage organization. But also we recognize that we're the boots on the ground for the international community, and we have a wider role to play, not just protecting the people of Kurdistan and Iraq, but also acting in concert with the international coalition against ISIS. But we need your help. We have been pleading with the international community to help us take care of the displaced communities, help us financially, help us by implementing projects, whether it's water purification, building schools for the displaced community and the host community, helping with healthcare. We've been asking for all of that. But more recently, we have had to ask for direct assistance to the Kurdistan Regional Government, because we have realized that after 2 years, it's untenable, it's unsustainable for the Kurdistan Regional Government to continue like this. We are at the brink of collapse. That collapse means that the fight against Daesh, the way that the Peshmerga can perform against Daesh, will be harmed, will be impacted unless the world unites to help us. The protection that we're providing, the safe haven we're providing to the Christians, Yazidis, Arabs, Kurds and others who have fled to Kurdistan will also be at risk. So over the past several months, we have been pleading with Congress, with the State Department, with the Department of Defense, to help us with direct foreign aid from the United States to the Kurdistan Regional Government, to the Peshmerga, for example, or to help us rebuild some of the areas destroyed by ISIS that we've liberated, help us with the humanitarian crisis, help us with the host community, which after 2 years since ISIS came and 4 or 5 years since the Syrian crisis, our host community is struggling. You know, I'll give you an example. In Kurdistan, we had solved the problem of electricity supply. We were at a level where the vast majority of the Kurdistan region in Iraq received close to 24 hours of electricity. Now, we've gone backwards. We've gone backwards several years, where electricity power cuts are the norm once again. So we're regressing because of the pressures on our economy and our government. In January 2015, we had the Kurdistan region's foreign minister, Fala Mustafa, and also the president of Kurdistan region's chief of staff, Fuad Hussein, visit Washington, and we even went to Tampa, Florida to visit CENTCOM, driving home the message that the Kurdistan region cannot continue under this kind of pressure. And also coming up in April, around mid-April, we will have a high-level delegation once again coming to Washington with the same message. This delegation will be led by the Deputy Prime Minister of the Kurdistan region, Qubat Talabani. So I want to reiterate to you that this financial crisis is real. It's a clear and present danger to the sustainability of the Kurdistan Regional Government, to the sustainability of our fight against ISIS, and our role as a safe haven for the minorities and other displaced people from Syria and from Iraq. Another point that I would like to highlight is how Kurdistan has been now recognized as a safe haven for minorities. A lot of people ask me, why is that? And the answer is, it's actually part of our culture. It's not something new. We have a deep-rooted culture of coexistence. We have a respect for people of every faith. We have a respect for people who speak different languages. we have a respect for minorities. And a lot of that is just historically, it's been there going back centuries. But even more recently, under Saddam Hussein and even previous regimes authoritarian regimes in Iraq, we Kurds were oppressed, we suffered genocide, repeated acts of genocide, chemical bombardment, a denial of our culture, a denial of our heritage. So we are very aware of what it's like for others to feel besieged, to feel denied, to feel under threat of genocide. We're very, very aware of that. And I think the combination of this culture of coexistence and the recognition of what it's like to be a minority that is under siege has meant that the people of Kurdistan, not just the ruling elite, but the people of Kurdistan have welcomed the Christians, Yazidis, Shabaks, Karkis, Turkmen, all the various ethnic and religious minorities in Iraq. We have welcomed them with open arms as they have fled violence across Iraq over the past decade, and particularly violence and genocide and crimes against humanity under the hands of ISIS. Now, I've spoken for a very long time. I don't know, John, if you want me to speak about anything else or whether we should now open up to questions.
Thank you so much, Bayan, for this important perspective. I think we can open up the lines for questions. And while the questions queue up, I'll invoke moderator's privilege to ask the first one. As a reminder to our audience members, if you'd like to ask a question, please press 5*. When it's your turn to ask a question, today's call administrator, Lindsay, will announce your name and unmute your line so that you may ask it. Lines will be placed back on mute immediately following the question. Also, please note that if you are in the queue and for any reason decide you no longer wish to ask your question, simply press 5* again and your name will be erased from the queue. Finally, for the sake of other callers, I ask that when you are called upon, please ask your question concisely. So for the first question from me, Bayan, you described a very complex environment that is a mix of survival, economically and physically, and reform. Where some might predicate their support for KRG economically on having confidence in progress and reform, whether that reform is economic or reform in governance and rights. So what does KRG consider its top priorities to further distinguish itself from its less stable neighborhood?
Well, thank you for that question, John. Reform has been on our agenda in the Kurdistan region, both the parliament, the government, our regional president, for a long time. And the one very thin silver lining of the current crisis that we're facing is that we are having to implement reform. Before we talked about it, we implemented it perhaps more slowly than we should have. But now that we're in this economic and security and humanitarian crisis, everybody is recognizing that there's no time to waste now. We need to go ahead with these reforms, as painful as they are, because, as you say, they are combined with this need to survive. So the reforms that have been announced really began about 12 months ago. Our Prime Minister has issued, I think, about 27 instructions and decrees that are to do with reform. The reform, for example, is with salaries and allowances. Government employees in Kurdistan region get huge allowances. Allowances, what does that mean? That means bonuses for having a PhD, a bonus for having so many children, and so on and so on, to the point where a government employee's salary, they take home every month, about 50% of it is their salary. Another 50% is all of these bonuses that add up, and these bonuses are now being reviewed, and we're really looking at, do we need all of these bonuses, which ones are really relevant, which ones are not. So these are the kinds of reforms that we're looking at. We also have a very heavy load on the government's shoulders in that overly large proportion of the workforce is actually employed by the government. Some of those are what we describe as ghost workers, meaning that they're registered as a government employee somewhere, they receive their salary, but actually they don't show up to work, they never have. So another thing that we're doing is reviewing who is doing what, and ghost employees will be laid off, and have been already. That process has already begun. Lots and lots of other things that I can give you as an example, but what I want to say about how can people believe that we're genuine about reform? First and foremost, as I said, we actually have no choice anymore. We've talked about reform for a long time. Now is the time to implement them because we have no choice. The other is that actually we are asking the international community to help us with a roadmap for reform and the implementation process. Just 2 weeks ago, the Kurdistan Regional Government's planning minister, Dr. Ali Sindi, he was here in Washington for meetings with the World Bank, and I joined him for several of those meetings. We also met with the State Department and others, again to reiterate this message of dire economic need in Kurdistan. But one of the very serious conversations that we're having with the World Bank, with the US government and other coalition partners is, how can you help us with a roadmap for reform and implementing the reform so that it's evidence-based, so that it will be painful, but how can we minimize that pain while also implementing these reforms?
Thank you so much for that answer, Bayan. And let me now turn to the first question from our callers.
Yes, thank you. Our first question today comes from David Lazar with the American Mesopotamian Organization. David, your line has been unmuted, so please ask your question.
Yes, I'd like first of all to make a comment and then state my question. Comment is Ms. Bayman also said that this is a history of coexistence between different ethnic groups and what she referred to as Kurdistan. Well, the history of there's no such coexistence. The history has been always Kurds grabbing lands of others, Kurds dominating, Kurds assassinating people, and no solution. There are hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of dunams or that lands taken of villages Kurdified completely by the KRG, and not an inch has been returned. So my question to Ms. Bayman is, when do you think you will resolve, and we keep hearing this is since 1991 and 1992 that committees have been formed, so these lands, these atrocities committing against the people of these villages, their lands to be given back to them. Now, I know there is another committees formed. There was last summer, but nothing has been done. Not an inch has been returned to the Assyrian owners of these lands. So, when do you think these issues will be resolved? And if you think within a year is a good time, and maybe perhaps next time when in a year from now we would have another conference call and you can give us some details on where and exactly specific details which lands were been returned to their owners. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I'm sorry, I didn't catch the gentleman's name. I don't know where you get your information or your misinformation. It's very, very clear that there is a culture of peaceful coexistence in Kurdistan. Kurdistan region in Iraq is open. People travel in and out. There are dozens of journalists there. There are international human rights organizations that go in and out. If the culture and the policies that you're describing were true, I think the world would have heard about it. I think you have a very, very distorted view of the reality on the ground. Let me, for example, I said that we have a deep-rooted culture of coexistence. We do. But also we have laws that protect minorities. For example, there is a draft Kurdistan region constitution. In that draft, there are many, many articles about the rights of people of different faiths and ethnicities. Also, the Kurdistan region parliament is one chamber. We have 111 seats. 11 of those seats are allocated to minorities, including Assyrians and Chaldeans. Our government employs many, many Assyrians, Chaldeans, Yazidis, and others, and most cabinets that I've ever remembered have included ministers from the minorities. Where you're right is that there are land disputes. I agree with that. But I should also say that these land disputes are not just between the Assyrians or Christians and the Kurds and the Muslims. These land disputes go from the very tip of Iraq in the north to the very tip of Iraq in the south. They were part of Saddam Hussein's policy. He would target one community and throw them against another. He would displace people from one village and throw people in there from another. There are, for example, instances where, let's say because of war or deliberate displacement, a Christian village would be evacuated, or people would be leaving out of choice, or not choice, voluntarily, but because of the dire situation. Another group maybe was also displaced. They would come to this village and they would occupy it or live there, but again out of desperation. Now, years later, decades later, the community that has settled there sees that village as their home, but the original Christian community, of course, sees it as their home too, and they have deeds to show that those homes and those villages belong to them. So it's a very, very complicated situation. This is decades and decades of different governments, Iraqi governments, playing one community against another, displacing one community out of one place to another. It's very, very complex, and it's actually one of the complex issues regarding the disputed territories, which we Kurds have wanted to be settled for a long time. So in summary, I'm very sorry that you have this misinformation. I'm very happy to send you lots and lots of detailed information by email. And the issue that you raised is an issue, but it's not just about Christians or Assyrians. It's about all communities across Iraq.
Thank you for that question and your answer. Our next question today comes from Ms. Mona Malik with the Assyrian Aid Society. Mona, you've been unmuted, so please ask your question.
Thank you. I just want to say that having been involved in an organization devoted to the Assyrian culture and heritage in our homeland of Iraq, I'm familiar with the issues that we have faced in the past decade or so, I would say, before ISIS. One of the main focuses of our organization is education and the preservation of our language in our schools. So since 1991, the Assyrian Aid Society has established 61 schools and about 9,000 children who are studying in our native language, the Assyrian Aramaic language. Well, now that with all the displacements, I'm sure that number has gone down to at least half of that. But before this crisis with ISIS and before the financial crisis, our president from the Assyrian Aid Society of America visited with the Minister of Education at the KRG, and he was told straight to his face that the reason we are not funding your schools, our schools, the Assyrian schools, is because we would prefer that you would teach the curriculum in Kurdish and just have an Assyrian class. We have struggled and paid for the whole curriculum to be translated into the Aramaic language, and basically it's an Assyrian Aramaic immersion school, and the kids come out, graduate with knowing Assyrian, English, Kurdish, and Arabic, so they don't miss out on anything. Since they are public schools, we are entitled to that share of the budget, that hasn't been paid for over 2 years. So my question to you is, how do we go on from here on in the future, trusting that we would be treated as equals and to preserve our heritage as well?
Thank you for your question. I'm a bit puzzled that you're saying that the Education Minister made this comment. As far as I'm aware, there are TV stations that broadcast in the Assyrian language, there are newspapers, websites, and there are schools that teach in the Assyrian language. Your final question was about how do we guarantee equality. Well, as I said earlier, there is in Parliament there is this allocation of seats to the minorities. The Kurdistan draft constitution has many, many articles about the rights of minorities, and a Kurdish think tank called MERI, which stands for MERI, which stands for the Middle East Research Institute. MERI, I think in the last few months, did research on the issue of all minorities in the Kurdistan region. And they issued a very, very, I think, I'm obviously not from the Assyrian group, but I believe that they issued a very useful document about not viewing minorities as minorities, but as you say, as equal citizens. You know, these are institutions that are respected in Kurdistan, and we listen to them. And I'm really delighted to hear that your organization has been able to do work in Kurdistan, and I hope that you'll be able to continue to do so. Right now, with the economic crisis in Kurdistan, we're all struggling. I mean, the idea of sharing budgets, sharing our budget, the problem is the budget is so tiny, and the priority has to go to the Peshmerga, who are protecting all of us. So these are important issues, but in my view, I think the fight against ISIS has to take priority over everything else.
Bayan, thank you so much for that answer. If I can just ask another question, based on the time that I've spent in Kurdistan, in Erbil and Dohuk, I am struck by the number of even residential homes that have different religious symbols displayed in the window, and even a sense of relative calm, only, as I said, tens of kilometers away from Mosul. And so can you talk just a little bit about your sense of ISIS's desire to overtake portions of Kurdistan, particularly Erbil or Dohuk, and maybe how successful efforts against ISIS in Mosul and elsewhere have been at keeping that from becoming the next headline?
Well, thank you, John. ISIS took over Mosul, which, as I said earlier, is the second largest and a very important city in Iraq. Of course, also they routed the Christians, the Yazidis, and many, many others from Nineveh, which is the province of where Mosul lies. And they also tried to attack Erbil, which is the regional capital of Kurdistan. And at that critical point, when the Yazidis were stranded on Mount Sinjar and were being beheaded and women were being enslaved, and at that exactly the same time ISIS was trying to attack Erbil, this is when President Obama and the United States began humanitarian assistance and airstrikes against ISIS. And we are very, very grateful to the U.S. administration, to Congress, and to the people of America for supporting us as we fight ISIS. You know, ISIS have their own ideology and their own, what I describe as a cult of death. They want to destroy any group or any society that doesn't share their view Their ideology is one of barbarity, of savagery, death, rape, and all done in the name of Islam, an Islam that I would say most Muslims don't recognize and want to disavow. ISIS has tried to take over Erbil. They are not far from our capital. They have used chemical weapons on the Gwer front. Gwer is maybe half an hour drive from Erbil city. They have used chemical weapons on Sinjar. And this is very worrying because Sinjar has been liberated, but people can't go back for two reasons. One, Sinjar has been completely destroyed. Totally, it's rubble now. There's nothing, there's no water, no health facilities, no electricity, so nobody can really live there until the place is reconstructed. But also, with ISIS launching rockets, and now some of those rockets are carrying chemical weapons into Sinjar, how on earth can people go back? So these are all very difficult issues, and this is why we're looking to the United States, which we see as our partner, militarily and on many other issues, to help us defeat ISIS and also to find a way for the people of Iraq, but particularly Nineveh province, to find a way for everybody to be able to go home peacefully and, most importantly, in safety. How can the Christians and the Yazidis and others ever go back to Nineveh, sometimes knowing that it was their neighbor that raped their daughter or beheaded their son? These are very, very difficult issues for the day after ISIS, but we need to confront them, we need to look at them, and we need to be honest about the tensions that there are and about real solutions, not, one of the things I don't like when people talk about reconciliation. What does reconciliation mean? Of course we want to live in peace and live together, but I also think people want justice. So justice has to be an important ingredient of reconciliation. Otherwise there's no trust between the communities.
Thank you for that. We had a caller emailing a question who was unable to actually ask it themselves, and they were just wondering if you could speak a little bit to the conditions there on the ground, at the camps, and just the hopes of the refugees, and just what you're hearing along those lines.
Thank you. Well, I have to just give you a little legal explanation as to why we always say refugees and internally displaced people. Internationally, in international law or conventions, refugees have a legal status, and the United Nations actually has a commission or an organization that takes care of refugees. Refugees technically are people who are displaced from one country into another. So when we talk about refugees in Kurdistan, we mean the Syrian refugees who have sought shelter in Iraqi Kurdistan. We have about 300,000 Syrian refugees in Iraqi Kurdistan. In addition to this 300,000, we have 1.5 million internally displaced people. Internally displaced people, or IDPs, are Iraqis who have fled Nineveh, Mosul, Anbar, Baghdad, Kirkuk, everywhere, to come and seek shelter in Kurdistan. They don't have the same legal status internationally. They don't have the same kind of international obligation for countries to assist them. It's basically down to the government of that country to take care of its own citizens. So technically, it's down to the Iraqi government to take care of internally displaced people. So I just wanted to give that explanation. Now, in Kurdistan region, we have 1.8 million displaced people and refugees. That means that 54% of the displaced and refugees in the country of Iraq are inside Kurdistan. 54%. Now, Kurdistan region is a very small part of Iraq, and yet we are looking after 54% of the displaced community. Baghdad provides tiny, tiny amounts of assistance to the displaced community. It doesn't help the Syrian refugees at all. We are reliant on the United Nations and aid agencies and so on to help. The United Nations struggles to raise even 50% of what it needs to help the displaced and refugees in Iraq. This has a real impact on those communities. The real impact is this. Financial vouchers that used to be given to people in camps have more or less disappeared, or they have shrunk dramatically. The food basket that used to be given out to people in camps has diminished. So the type of food, the amount of food that every family received is diminishing. I think about 56 or 58% of children from the displaced community are not in school. This is a time bomb. This is a lost generation that we're talking about. Healthcare is one of the biggest issues facing the people of Kurdistan and the displaced and the refugee communities. Our hospitals are under enormous pressure because we have a 30% increase in population. And yet, we don't have a 30% increase in hospitals, in clinics, in doctors, nurses, or medication. In fact, we have a reduction. So the conditions for the refugees and displaced people in Iraqi Kurdistan are desperate. And this is why they're leaving and risking their lives and the lives of their children to get in a rickety boat to try to make it to Europe. And this is why we're even beginning to see host community, the people of the Kurdish or Iraqi Kurdistan community, trying to leave for Europe, because they also are being impacted. So the situation is very, very desperate. And I go back to the introductory remarks that I made. We need financial assistance to the Kurdistan Regional Government to help us pay for the Peshmerga so that they can continue the fight, but also to the refugees and the displaced, because their situation is dire. So anything that any of you can do to raise the profile of this crisis, to provide practical help, whether it's through your churches, your societies, your university organizations, anything, please, I plead with all of you. This is the time to help the people in the camps and even those outside of the camps. You know, most of the displaced are actually not in camps. They're living on roadsides. They're living in half-finished buildings. They need your help.
Bayan, thank you very much for that. If I may, not to dominate with too many questions, but I'd just like to connect just a couple of dots and hear your reaction to this. One, it's kind of a year of anniversaries, 25-year anniversary of Provide Comfort, the 100-year anniversary of Sykes-Picot. Additionally, I spent a few days in Marrakesh, Morocco back in January, where many callers know, and Bayan, I know that you know, some 250 leaders, religious leaders, and experts from, quote, Islamic territories around the world, as well as 70 other leaders and experts from non-Muslim countries, leading NGOs and other religious scholars gathered together to talk about a framework for rights for minorities, again, in what they were calling Islamic territories. What I'd like to ask you is, and we've heard from some questions on the call that there are disputes, there are grievances, and they're not just within Kurdistan to the outside, they are within Kurdistan and minorities. So, you know, invoking the concept of an anniversary and looking forward at what's possible, and really just even using as a light touchstone this commitment coming out of Marrakesh for protection of minority rights, first and foremost, as an element of governance, is what Foreign Minister Falah said in our meeting, which I haven't heard an official use the word forgiveness before, and he did. Is that what this time is about? Not obscuring the difficulties and the grievances that you've described, one community against another, but just saying we are in the situation that is either going to go backwards or forwards. and let's take this opportunity to move forward. This is what I heard from the foreign minister. I'm wondering if you would just comment on my attempt to connect all those dots.
Thank you, John. You're right. It's the year of these anniversaries, Operation Provide Comfort, which saved so many lives 25 years ago. And then the 100-year anniversary of Sykes-Picot, which I would argue has cost so many lives across the Middle East, including in Iraq. I think the Marrakesh Declaration was very important. It didn't really resonate very much around the world, and it's sad that really the media didn't pick up on the Marrakesh Declaration because it was very positive, and it was a sign of the Muslim community waking up and deciding that they're going to do something to counter these messages of negativity and death and destruction that we constantly hear from ISIS. The question of forgiveness and moving on, I think this is a very good idea, but it needs to be reciprocated. What do I mean by that? In 1991, after Saddam was pushed out of Kuwait, he started to attack, and there was an uprising. There was an uprising in Kurdistan and in southern Iraq against Saddam's regime. And Saddam brutally crushed the uprising in the south, and the Kurds in the north fled to the mountains of Iran and Turkey for safety. And this is where Operation Provide Comfort came about. Eventually, the Kurds came back. We went back to Kurdistan. We were protected in a no-fly zone that stretched for 12 years, thanks to the United States and other countries. Now, when the Kurds went back, and there was that fight with Saddam's apparatniks in Iraq, there was a decision that the Kurdish leadership had to make. There were tens of thousands, if not more, hundreds of thousands maybe, of Iraqi regime operators, let's say the secret police, the intelligence, the torturers, the murderers, those who had blood on their hands. And our leadership had to make a decision. Do we go for revenge or do we go for forgiveness? And we opted for forgiveness. And those people were just told to leave. They were told, leave Kurdistan. We can't guarantee that the community will not want revenge, but we as the leaders of Kurdistan suggest that you leave, and we forget what happened while you were here. But that hasn't been reciprocated by others in Iraq. So in my view, forgiveness, maybe this is a controversial view, that you should forgive anyway. I know that in Christianity you believe in turning the other cheek. It's very hard to turn the other cheek when repeatedly the other side comes back and commits genocide against you, throws chemical bombs at your people, rapes and pillages as we've seen in Nineveh. So forgiveness, I think, is a very good concept, but it needs to have a proper foundation whereby everybody agrees to forgive, whereby everybody agrees to reconciliation and justice. I think one side agreeing to it is just not going to work. And as for Sykes-Picot, this is 100 years old. What does it mean? It means that the Sykes-Picot borders of the Middle East were the brainchild of men who were born in the 19th century. These are men of 19th century ideas and ideologies, of empires. We should start thinking like people of the 21st century. We should start realizing that these borders have failed, that thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, have suffered under these borders, and it's time to rethink them.
Thank you so much for that. Let me just make sure if Lindsay has another email question that came in.
Yes, we have a question from Linda Barrow, who is a professor at Poe College. Linda, your line has been unmuted, so please ask your question.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate your cogent remarks about the challenges facing Kurdistan. And I'm wondering, in light of all these challenges, and including ISIS and so on, what does that mean about the long-term push for independence? Is this simply not the right time, or are there higher priorities? How would you respond to that?
Thank you very much. Independence has been our aspiration from day one. Nobody asked, we were just talking about Sykes-Picot. Nobody asked the people of Kurdistan, do you want to be divided up between 4 countries? At the end of the First World War, European powers were dividing up the Ottoman Empire, the European empires, the Persian Empire, and drawing borders according to the will and the needs and aspirations of those European powers, not according to what the locals wanted. So nobody asked the people of Kurdistan, do you want to be divided up between Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria? And in the past 100 years, the Kurdish people, the people of Kurdistan, have been denied their language. We have been denied our culture, our history. Our heroes have been wiped out from history books, or they have been claimed as others, as their heroes. Many Arabs, for example, have been surprised to learn recently that Salahuddin Ayyubi was actually Kurd. So we haven't been happily part of those countries that Kurdistan has become part of. Iran, Turkey, Iraq, Syria, they have had histories of dictatorship, authoritarianism, I would say even apartheid against the Kurdish communities. We're not talking about, for example, Scotland within the United Kingdom, where the United Kingdom is democratic, people have language rights. In Wales, every road sign is written in Welsh and English and so on. You're talking about the Middle East, where democracy, language rights, historical rights, heritage, these are not really concepts that come naturally to the Middle East. So the idea of independence has been there since the day Kurdistan was divided. It's not a new idea. We in Iraqi Kurdistan have never been shy of talking about independence, of being very clear that we are on the path of independence, and this is a process that has already begun. I know that many in the United States welcome that, but probably an equal number are very concerned about that. One of the concerns is that an independent Iraqi Kurdistan would cause instability in the Middle East. I ask you, is there stability in the Middle East? Is there? What stability are we trying to protect? We have ISIS controlling 1/3 of territory in Iraq and probably a similar amount in Syria. We have had a history of coup d'etats, bloody handing over of power from one government to another in Iraq. We've had chemical bombardment, genocide. What kind of stability are we talking about in Iraq or the Middle East that the world wants to preserve? I would argue that an independent Iraqi Kurdistan could be the beacon of stability in the Middle East. We already have a culture of peaceful coexistence. We are an island of democracy in a sea of authoritarian regimes. And we look to the West for shared values, for transfer of knowledge, for learning how to deepen our democratic credentials, how to bring about transparent reforms. Isn't that a better partner for the United States and the West than the current regimes in the Middle East that the United States sees as its partner? So we are on the path to independence. I don't know when it will happen, but I'm confident that every day we're closer to it. President Barzani has announced that he would like a referendum on self-determination for Iraqi Kurdistan to take place in 2016. Now, I expect that should that referendum go ahead this year, the vast majority of people will vote yes to self-determination. That doesn't mean that the next morning President Barzani or whoever is president is going to announce independence for Kurdistan. What that means is that the Kurdish leadership will have the mandate and the authority to negotiate independence with Baghdad, with the international community. So this is where we're heading. It's a process. We're on the path. We want it to happen peacefully and through dialogue.
Thank you, Bayan. We had one more question that was just emailed in. Again, they weren't able to ask it. So the question is, we understand sometimes, the term Islamic governance might not resonate well with everyone, but would you perhaps speak to what your and the KRG vision for good governance in the region, what kind of form that would take?
Yes, I think the reason why Islamic governance maybe put some people off in the Middle East is that you have the Islamic Republic of Iran, you have the Saudi Arabian form of Islamic governance, which I, as a woman, I respect Saudi Arabia, but I as a woman, would object to not being able to drive, to barely being able to vote, let alone to be able to represent my country as I do in a diplomatic post. So I think this is why sometimes people are very sensitive about the term Islamic governance. Kurdistan region is by majority a Sunni Muslim area, but of course we have Shia Muslim Kurds, we have the Christians, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Yazidis, and people of other faiths. There are, Mandaeans, Kakayis, and others. So what would be the ideal form of governance somewhere like Kurdistan? I think first and foremost it has to be democratic, but also we should respect the tenets of Islam and other faiths. We should respect language rights, heritage rights. There should be the rule of law, and there should be the principle of coexistence on an equal basis, a partnership rather than majority versus minority. This would be absolutely the ideal. Of course, achieving the ideal is, I don't know if any country can say that it's achieved the ideal, but this is what we should be aiming for, and this is what we should be implementing in our laws, in our constitution, in our governance in Kurdistan and Iraq and other places in the Middle East.
Bayan, thank you so much for your remarks, your perspective, your insights, and this sort of glimpse on a constructive future and also the challenges to a positive way forward. It's been very helpful, and as we said at the beginning of the call, the implications for where Kurdistan goes next, where the region goes next, where the international community goes next in terms of its levels of support and investment will have profound implications even to the world, which is so focused on this important region for so long. I'd like to give you just one more minute to wrap up with parting comments, and in doing so say that we look very much forward to the April event here in D.C., where in our previous discussions you've made clear that it is intended to be a candid dialogue that will welcome voices from all sides so that we can achieve something that resembles a sense of reconciliation towards coexistence and stability. So with that, I'll give you the final minute and thank all of our callers.
Well, thank you very much, John, again for giving me this opportunity to address your callers and listeners. I would like to really just go back to where I started, which is we are in this economic crisis, which is hampering our ability to fight ISIS. It's hampering our ability to take care of the 1.8 million refugees and displaced people, and it's hampering our ability to sustain stability and a peaceful coexistence in Kurdistan region, because everyone and everything is financial stress right now. I I ask all of you, in whatever way you can assist us, whether it's just by advocacy or bringing something practical, help us. We see ourselves as being in partnership with the United States, not just in the fight against ISIS, but in so many other issues. We have shared values with you. We believe in being part of the international community. We want to abide by these international norms and rules and to be a good partner and a reliable partner for the United States and European countries as well. So to continue with that partnership and solidarity, we need the United States to support us through this financial crisis. Once again, I'd like to thank John, Chris Sapel as well for making this happen, and I also look forward to the event on April the 12th when hopefully we can continue this dialogue in a very frank and productive way.
Perfect. Thank you once again, Bayan, so much, and forward to continuing this dialogue and collaboration. Thank you to all our callers. We will announce the guest speaker for our April call in the days ahead. Thanks once again. Have a wonderful day.